know how it identified me on some of these things because I didn't introduce myself. Because why would I do that? And it did make one mistake. It picked up someone who had jumped in on the mic as the person who was in queue, and it was quite funny.
All right, it is.
It's time. Take a seat.
All mine? Crap. I never liked you anyway. For the record. Welcome everybody to the very first SPICE working group meeting. How many of you have actually participated in the BOFs? Ooh. How many of you, this is all like brand new stuff? All right. We've hopefully have you covered, but there will be a little bit of a learning curve. Okay. As always, by now you should have read this many, many times, embraced it, loved it, put it on a Post-it note for you to remember always. Note the note well. A couple IETF meeting tips. If you're here, you know, I've been to many working group meetings this week, and every single one had at least one person's phone ring. So please join in. Please put your phones on mute. Sign in on the data tracker. If you are remote, please keep your audio and video off. All the usual hygiene for meetings. In our agenda, so the way we're working today is, of course, we have an hour, and then there's a break, and then there's another hour. We've got a fair amount of time to get through everything. If we end early, I don't think that's going to break anybody's heart, but we will see how it goes. We're not promising, because as soon as you promise that, the meeting runs long. I've learned that to be true. Okay, so we're going to start with, well, what is SPICE? Now, if you participated in the BOF, you have probably read the charter. I mean, we are focused on digital credentials and their presentation. This, I want to emphasize, this covers both human and non-human use cases. That's part of why I wanted to be chair for this, because I find that space overlapping to be fascinating, because they're sometimes different ultimate requirements and sometimes not. So it's a very chewy problem. And we're going to be developing digital credential profiles for various use cases that we've identified, and we're actually going to talk about those use cases in a little bit. We do have security and privacy as part of what we're doing that must be considered. And sometimes in considering it, it will be like, this is a very critical, important thing. And sometimes we're going to say, this doesn't apply for this use case, and that's going to be okay. So something to think about. Considerations will include issues around confidential computing, remote attestation, trusted environments, etc. And I believe I see someone in queue. Now I have to figure out what button to push. Okay.
Hi, Brian Campbell. You mentioned the charter. I was a participant in...
Can you speak up?
How's this?
Better.
Sorry, I'm feeling a little cheeky right now, but I was a participant. My name is Brian Campbell. I work for Ping Identity. I'm here representing myself, I think, because that's how this works, but I can never quite keep track. I was a participant in the BOF circa Brisbane at the last time, which, as my memory serves, was quite contentious. There were a number of suggested changes to the text around which there seemed to be something approaching the rough consensus of the room. Your co-chair there, hi Martin, submitted PRs to the then BOF or then charter text in the in whatever repo it was. Anyway, that stuff was sort of ignored and things proceeded on with it, with the charter, and it was voted on and so forth. And I raised the question a few times. I'm not really invested that much in it, although one of them I actually made a PR suggestion to that Martin's was better and overrid it. It doesn't matter, but it seems like there were a number of processy type things that were just sort of discarded. And in the interest of just sort of, I don't know, the time and effort that went into that meeting, people left like all fired up, and it was almost like it didn't happen. And as someone who traveled halfway around the world or more to be a part of that, it's a little bit disconcerting. And be involved in some other things like this. Here I am. I wasn't going to say anything, but I got a little
But you
fired
have
up.
questions. Understood. Do you want to take?
Yeah,
this one? I was gonna
not
call for one of the
concerns.
ADs.
Maybe would be better.
Aha. Right.
Thank you for your time and attention to this matter.
Thank you. I recognize your concerns, which I will summarize as there were a bunch of open PRs against the charter that did not appear to be merged. And the question is more towards the area director as to the process for what the charter is versus what's in those PRs and how that's all supposed to come together.
Sorry, Paul Wouters, AD. I just walked in, so I might have missed some previous discussion. Sorry about that. If the working group thinks that there is some, and they agree on a few changes to the charter, then we can just do a quick recharter to fix that. That's not a problem for me.
So maybe what we can do here is we can take Brian's comment here as an agenda bash. I'll try to put something together toward the end of this session, and we can talk about those changes to the charter and see if we can come up with a quick revision. Would that be acceptable to you?
Consider it bash, just although frankly, I'm more concerned about the process that got us here without them than the actual changes themselves.
Right.
So maybe I've been heard, and that's good enough.
I think probably we can have a short conversation after this or during the break time with the folks involved there and see what happened.
Thank you.
I don't think we need to spend working group time on that.
You're right. Thank you.
Thanks.
One of the things that did, in the charter as it currently stands is coordination with a bunch of different working groups. So I had a chance to go to SCIT, to Whimsy, to OAuth. I know we've got folks involved in RATS and Jose and Coze, and that's just as well because SPICE has been mentioned in all of them this week as an area of interest. So expect a lot of coordination across several different working groups. Now, there's a couple things that are out of scope, specifically general key discovery, and we are not trying to create new cryptographic primitives. Full stop. Don't do that. Okay, we do have, obviously we have a mailing list. We also have a GitHub repository. That repository will be for drafts that have been adopted by the working group. It's not going to be just like open to any and all things. I want to keep that for things that we've actually agreed to adopt. So that is there. It's currently empty, but it's there, and that's what we'll start using.
You want to have a brief conversation about how we want to work? Yeah. So this might be a good this thing is terrible. It might be a good opportunity to have a brief discussion about how we expect to work. I'd like input as to whether or not people will feel comfortable with the idea that we could have substantive discussion on GitHub, or whether people would prefer to have the substantive discussion on the mailing list. And that, I realize, can be controversial. So ultimately, the chairs are just looking for your input, and I think we'll probably have to make a decision based on that input. But keep this brief. Mike.
I personally like major decisions like adoption, et cetera, done on the list per normal process. However, when iterating on drafts and tracking issues, GitHub is a wonderful place because it keeps the list from having code that sometimes can't be read depending on someone's mail client and how they cut and paste it or whatever. So strong preference to GitHub for normal working actions. So.
Brent Zundell, GitHub, please. All right, Ori Steele, I like confirming things on the list. I also like pull requests and discussion and issue tracking on GitHub. But I leave it to chairs and ADs to sort all this out.
Hi, this is Henkes, potential contributor. GitHub is great for the daily work. It's not so great for bigger decision making. So we have this bot thingy that could do a weekly summary of things that moved on GitHub. I think that's something that can be added when there's a first repository.
Yep.
And then I think chairs and other contributors can highlight stuff. Also, interims might be a thing. Yeah. So, but GitHub first, and the mail list is for the real discussions, not for the red holding.
So what I'm hearing here is that there's general desire to get the nuts and bolts done in GitHub, and that's great. We will probably ask the editors of any document. Oh, sorry, Q.
Q Marcel, MPI Inf. Keep the code and boring technical discussion on GitHub. Keep the substantive discussion on the mailing list. I'm not going to look at GitHub as often as I look at the mailing list.
Right. Hey, Fleming.
Fleming Francisco, what he said.
All right. This is overwhelmingly, we need the important stuff on the mailing list for discussions. To some extent, we are going to rely on the discretion of editors to identify those things. Whenever there's any controversial points, whenever there's any major decisions to be made, we'll ask that people bring that to the mailing list. And anyone can do that. It's just not just the editors, but that will be the primary responsibility of those folks. I don't think we need to hum on that one. That seemed pretty overwhelming to me. So that's what we'll tentatively set up, I think.
Okay. So one of the groups that we're coordinating with is Whimsy, the workload identity in something. I always remember it for 5 minutes and then go back to Whimsy. And this was Justin and Peter were going to present this, except they're not here. Where's Peter? Oh, there you are. Peter, did you not know this was you and Justin?
I knew it was Justin. Oh, I should go to the front.
Come up to the front.
This is that's a health and safety thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess just move forward. Okay, so recently, well, not so recently formed, just before Brisbane, the workload identity and multi-system environments is really focused on developing standards to secure workload-to-workload communications, and also documenting best practices, as well as filling various gaps when you start working in these microservices architecture. So maybe next slide, please. So what is a workload? It is a running instance of software executing for a specific purpose. And next, Heather, thank you. So for example, you can have, next one. Maybe back one. So basically, each of these things potentially are workloads or made up of multiple workloads, your client, your gateway, and then the various microservices behind that. Next slide, please. So workload identity, this has actually been a bit of a topic in, or a bit of a discussion in the working group this week, and also leading up to this, about what is a workload identity. So it's a means of identifying a workload in a way that makes sense in its context. And my co-chair has just arrived, and so I'm sure he's going to come and fill in here.
Hi, Justin Richer, channeling Brian Campbell.
Oh, like, yeah, it's the second time this week. Anyway. One of the things that we did actually decide this week is that instead of trying to define workload identity, we're going to sort of first focus in on the components. What is the identifier? What is the credential format, etc. Next slide, please, Heather. Okay, and Justin, do you want to talk to this one?
Hi, sorry about that. I thought this started at 5:30. All right, so a workload, as I'm sure Peter talked about, is a running piece of software in context. Did I get the order right? Cool, good enough. And so the thing is, when you're identifying a workload in a running system, you want to be able to talk about, not only do I know that this particular component exists, I want to know what it's talking to. And in a lot of cases, I want to know the path. I want to know the graph of all the calls that were made from here to there. Next slide. And multi-system environments means that we are not always talking inside the same cloud. We've got things that, like, part of it's running on Azure, part of it's running on AWS. We need to be able to deal with things in ways that cross boundaries. So all of the solutions in Whimsy need to work not only inside a particular environment, but also be designed in such a way that they either work or at least consider how things look when you're crossing these boundaries. Next slide. Because when you're connecting out to a system, in a lot of cases, you don't know how everything is going to be composed ahead of time. So this service might need to call something else that's got a whole chain of things. And this guy down at the end here, Quux, might actually still need to know the name of the user that came in. That's something that is 2 environments removed from the processing here. How do we carry that context? How do we even reason about that? That's the type of stuff that we need to do inside of Whimsy. Next slide. Sorry, out of breath, kind of ran over here. All right, we are working on problems that are unique to workload style environments. That's really the core differentiation of Whimsy. And we're also trying to solve general problems like, how do you identify a person or a piece of software, but in the unique context of a workload environment. So there's a lot of great work that's happening here in Skit, in other places about identifying people in software and whatnot. What does that mean in the context of a workload? That's what we're trying to work on in Whimsy. We're trying to bring together different communities that are working on the different pieces of this, and realizing that we're not going at this with a blank page. People have already built out a whole bunch of stuff out of duct tape and baling twine because they needed to solve problems. We need to figure out what the shape of that duct tape is and write it down at the very least, which is what I'm trying to get Hannes to do. But we need to write down what people have done, but also try to come up with better solutions for what we can do going forward. Next slide, please. Importantly, with Whimsy, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not doing. Some of this is stuff that we'll be doing here in Spice. Some of this is stuff that's happening elsewhere. Even not outside of the IETF, there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. Everything we do in Whimsy is going to touch all of this in one way or another, though, whether it's being carried as part of the context, whether it's part of the processing, anything like that. We need to be able to figure that out without trying to solve all of these problems from whole cloth. Next slide. And that's it. Please join the mailing list, join the working group. We're doing some fun stuff. And occasionally the chairs actually keep their schedule and show up on time. Thanks. Thanks, Justin.
All right. Start. Spiff. Confirm. Yes. Mike.
Trying to decide which of these paths has less of a trip hazard, and I just ripped this off of whatever Ori did. That's where this came from. Sorry, I copied your slides for the deck. So next slide, please. We're going to talk a bit about use cases. This is just a quick recap of things that are in the charter and proposed revisions to the charter that may somehow have forgotten if it merged, but we'll figure that out. But basically, why are we here? I think really what started this work, aside from a hallway conversation, was to go through and start to figure out how can we document and define use of three-party model credentials. So this is issuer, verifier, holder stuff, and we'll come back to that in a minute. With COSE specifically, right? How can we do this stuff in binary as opposed to JSON or other encodings? And especially recognizing that a lot of the folks looking at three-party model scenarios we're looking at human in the loop cases or cases dealing with people in the mix or PII type stuff and things like that. And there are a lot of cases that are really machine to machine, right? System to system type scenarios. Next slide. So quick definition, I think from faces, I recognize that many people are familiar with these terms, but I also suspect there might be some new folks. So just in case, an issuer is the person that's kind of like signing up and generating up the credential to begin with, right? They're really constructing and securing the initial credential. Holders are things or people, but some kind of wallet oftentimes gets used in terms of people cases. Other terms come up that controls how credentials get disclosed. I just ripped some of this terminology out of what was in a charter draft. I'm not saying I agree with it, and I am sure Brent Zundel can comment on some of this. But this is what's in there now, and we can improve this. Verifier, that's verifying a signature, right? Did this work, right? Is it what I thought it was? Next slide. So, recapping, basically, what were some of the other motivating factors, right? We're really after binary credentials, right? So CBOR stuff. We want cryptographic agility, right? A lot of us have cases that are requiring post-quantum for government reasons and things like that. So we got to make sure that's there. And we want to make sure that we could preferably use FIPS approved stuff or NIST approved stuff. With both regular fully signed credentials and with selective disclosure type mechanisms. We understand there are problems with SD type credentials, right? JWT, SD, JWT, SD, CWT, whatever you want to call it, depending on the variation. There are some possible things around linkability and stuff like that that aren't ideal. We'll get to that. But right now it's what we've got. The other side is that in a lot of the machine-to-machine cases, especially supply chain stuff and things like that, or things dealing with regulatory cases, right? I personally have systems that have to deal with did we log evidence around compliance with something, right? Some of these things can be very, very long-lived. And in those cases, right, some of the things that deal with more privacy pass type scenarios and things like that don't really apply. So it's a case we have to be aware of. Next slide. So the two sets of use cases that came to mind when we were first kind of bashing around some ideas and starting to get an email together on this, the initial motivator, especially for myself, and I know some others in the room, was physical supply chain stuff, right? How do we handle things like import permits or capturing data around traceability, other things like that. The other side was credentials around authenticity and provenance, right? How do we describe the shape? How do we permit things like selective disclosure around some of that? Cases like what data went into trading a model and things like that. So do we have the right things for that? And I'll pause because I see a cue.
I was going to ask if you wanted to take questions during or after.
Yeah, I'm totally fine for during. I like a little chaos.
Question, not a comment.
No chaos, but I would appreciate, so when you say selective disclosure, to me, that rings a very strong human privacy bell. And so I would appreciate the use case for selective disclosure, machine to machine.
Excellent use case. So I'll give you one directly out of supply chain that comes up all the time, which is if you have, and I'll take USDA APHIS because that's the organization I'm most familiar with. If they go out and do a foreign site inspection at an agricultural facility, what comes of that is a nice little package of data, right? And the results of that will get shared to multiple parties. The details of that are shared on a need-to-know basis based on rule lists and who actually has hierarchies. So it ends up coming into a system. That credential then, rather than having to re-sign every single time for each receiving party, can be broken up and then distributed as needed with perhaps, hey, this passed or this failed, but not necessarily the details that might contain proprietary information to the receiver.
Thank you.
Next slide. So what's next? We're going to talk about some other stuff. I do have a question for the chairs and probably for the folks that are here as part of this working group or just shadowing this working group, waiting for interesting things to happen or not happen, which is, do we want a use case doc in this group, right? Is that something we can maintain? Not necessarily thinking this is going to be normative or anything. It could be a web file, but I have found that useful in other groups. Like, can we document and improve? In fact, it came to mind, especially in the DM conversation earlier this week, of like, wow, we're talking about a lot of this stuff. Maybe we could add some of this information here so it's well captured. So thoughts, poll, maybe, I don't know.
There's a microphone. I don't want to just hear from us. We have opinions, but.
Mahmoud Al-Khaishi here. I think a use case document would be a really good idea. Having been part of the DM conversation this week, there were a lot of stuff that happened there that I really think should be part of SPICE, and unless people can see it written down in a clear way, they will just not get it.
Thank you.
Roy Williams, Microsoft. I think the use case specifically around the different verticals or uses that we have will lay a basic foundation, like the software supply chain and product versus factory and company physical supply chain are interesting, but they're not necessarily the same. So the use case would help lay that out.
Justin Richer, I think use cases and writing them down is vitally important, especially when work is getting started. I think that having them be in a known location is also really important. And I think a use case document for a working group as a published artifact is one of the stupidest things that I have seen done at the IETF. And we absolutely should not do that. And I mean that in the normative sense. We would have to have a very, very good reason to actually do that. The reason for this is that use cases change. You would want to add some, remove some, explain them, and none of this is conducive to the RFC archival format. I have also seen working groups put a ton of effort into getting the use cases exactly right to the detriment of actually making any progress on any technology to implement or address any of those use cases. Use cases fundamentally are about setting tone, setting focus, setting sort of fence around what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. And for that, some type of document where it's written down is beautiful and wonderful. As a working group artifact, please no.
So Justin, would you advise us to adopt the document, but have and have a note in it simply saying do not publish?
So this is actually something that has come up in Whimsy recently. Right. And I think that there are basically three main paths that could be taken. Adopt the document as an eternal ID. Put everything into a wiki, like an official working group controlled wiki, of which we've got access to like 3 or 4 main ones, right? With official IETF branding. Or just have somebody put it on a web page somewhere and tell everybody, go there. It's a lot less official, but it's also effective. And, you know, I don't know what the right answer is, but they all have trade-offs. I do think that making it RFC track in any fashion, that's the real mistake to avoid.
Okay, thank you.
So this is Hank at the mic. Justin is in punching distance. I'm absolutely in favor of Justin to propose user journeys to publish as RFCs, or data journeys. I love them. But joking aside, the construction of use cases is the basis for requirements, is basis for actually the whole solution. So saying that use cases change means that your requirements change, means that your solution has to be adopted. And if it is not extensible and adaptable enough, and you're shaking your head, you can argue against this, of course. But if the requirements change, you have to change something else typically. Or you build a solution that is already that flexible or extensible, that's not a pain in the neck. So I think that is what we're targeting here. And the use cases will always remind us, and we don't have to publish them as a RFC, it's absolutely clear. But it's very important to write them down and not publish them, yes. And maybe have 1 or 2 user journeys in the text to understand why we are all doing this. Then that's a middle ground I think we can all agree on.
All right, Steve.
Steve Lasker, I just +1 to just put them in GitHub in the same working group with no intention to publish them This way you solved your central discovery problem and not killing yourself with overhead and process to finish it.
CrEdentials MPIN. I would like to remind the group of the WG adopted informational status in the data tracker, which is an explicit marker that this document will not be published as an RFC, but it is adopted by the working group as a useful document to inform its work.
Sounds like a lot of people want to do that. The question is, do we want to adopt this? Is the next one. I think we're going to just do a brief show of hands. People who think that this is the right sort of thing to, oh, Hank. Show of hands means ask the poll.
So does this show of hands implies the existence of another option?
Sorry?
Does this show of hands imply the existence of another option than this?
I think you might want to put it like, should we adopt the?
Because I mean,
Are you volunteering to write another option? Hank?
no.
Should we adopt? Oh, and if anyone wants to use this time to get up and tell us that that's a bad idea, the microphone is right there. Watson.
I think we might want to see a couple more. I think this document's useful. I don't think it's necessarily the only use case that participants here care about, and I would encourage people to either on the list or in the form of a draft write down things you might not have thought of here.
Thanks, Watson. 100% agreed. This would be an input document that we understand is very, very skeleton-y and non-complete, and that gives the working group a chance to make sure we're getting good coverage on it and factoring in all things. So does that answer your question there? We're not intending this to be like the end-all be-all use case. This is version 0.
The expectation is that once it's a working group document, it's the working groups, and if people want to discuss use cases, we'll do that. The chairs will consult with Mike and the other co-authors on this input document, and we'll talk about adoption, confirming on the list, as it were.
Okay.
All right,
Thank you
thanks,
so
Mike.
much. And I'm going to present on this too, but first I'm going to note, because he told me I could, that I can blame Ori for the naming of this document because of that little BCP at the end. So I don't know if he wants to throw a little comment in there. Perhaps there was some spice involved.
Yeah, so after having sat in the whimsy sessions, calling something a BCP when you're having your first ever working group meeting, and this is the -00 draft, is super bad idea. That's my fault. The reason that that name was chosen was to try and spark the sort of imagination of what we wanted this to be. We wanted to provide guidance, guidelines. There's so many words I could have used that would be better, but you can. It's my fault. That's it.
That's why we love you, Ori. Next slide, please. So what is this doc and why is it here? Well, this doc really started because I occasionally interact with these like policy regulatory folks. It's something that happens in my life now, I guess. And they're consistently always saying like, hey, I want to own, or am required to own perhaps by law, the actual like data elements themselves, what can be shared to who and things like that, especially in a regulatory context. But what they don't want to do is go into GitHub, because they're not GitHub-y kind of people. In fact, they tend to work in things like Microsoft Word with track changes on and run them by lawyers and things like that. However, a lot of times they're writing docs on things that will end up going over the wire or get modeled in some kind of data schema or structure somehow. And what ends up happening oftentimes, we'll take a look at in just a minute here, but is that interesting things tied to specific encodings or formats will get looped into these policy docs. I've seen things like fixed delimited COBOL and wire transmission things described in actual policy docs, and that's kind of problematic. So we wanted to just kind of put together some guidance around how do you write a policy doc so that a normal programmer or system could go take a look at this doc and then turn it into something that's actually useful from a data structure side, right? So we could separate the encoding, possibly the security standards, et cetera. Next slide. So once again, how do we separate out, right, the things that should be separated out, right? We don't really want to kind of try to merge together in one thing or in one standard, the data shape and the encoding, the mechanisms for securing that data, the actual transport mechanisms. A lot of times that stuff gets all blended together. Sometimes that's a good thing. Oftentimes it's painful. And so what this draft is really intended to do is to help policymakers and regulators describe the data shape and the encoding without mixing the two, right? Allow encoding to be separated out as appropriate and permit upgrades. Next slide. And so once again, I did this because I was asked to do it. And I actually thought it was a good idea, and I thought it was kind of a good way out to help provide some guidance here. Let's go more. So an example case, I'm going to use a very specific one. Folks that are international trade, this is almost exactly the way that it was phrased to me, need to be in control of the changes. I need to be able to say, hey, we changed the name of this, or suddenly now we need this specific date added in, right? Not just the date that something was transported, maybe the date that they ordered it, right? Things like that. But they don't necessarily know all the technical details under the hood, but they do want to bind it to good guidance, right, as required possibly by FIPS or NIST, and then they want to leverage open standards where appropriate, et cetera. That's cool. We want to encourage that, right? We want to encourage people to reference IETF work or elsewhere. And so basically the request was, I want to just give you a table of what data I want to collect where and what the names need to be, because that's what the law tells me, but I don't want to get any further than that. So it's the starting place. Next slide. I'm going to pull up a nice little fun example. This is something that got handed to me a couple of years ago. This is our most modern new thing for how we're going to digitally exchange credentials. Oh boy, this was fun. Does anyone in here, just random show of hands, recognize this doc? Am I the only strange person that works on organic products? It's a phytosanitary cert. This is ePhyto. This was the collection of years and years of work. It was a masterpiece, and it's just now finally getting adopted. Like, we're just now seeing traction of this stuff going over the wire using an Excel schema that is just megabytes and megabytes and megabytes huge, that all has to be read in order to transform this stuff. And it's baked into Word docs and PDFs and things like that. All this fun little stuff. Next slide.
Do you want to take a question from Tony?
Oh, yes, Tony, please.
Yeah. So I'm hearing signs of a data model here, which I hope is not the case.
Yeah, we're going to get to what we actually want to give them the ability to do. So let's pop to the next one. We want to pull those couple of columns in the middle out, right? We want to give folks the ability that have to write these policies to say, yep, I need to collect this information. Maybe there's some constraints. Maybe it needs to be numeric or something else. But that's about the most I want to do, right, is to specify those things. Next slide. So we want to have them do that without having to bake in a requirement that says, nope, you've got to go do it in this. In fact, there was a suggestion made somewhere that, like, hey, we actually like bind the reg to like a JSON LD context or something. And I saw another one that was like, nope, we're going to go in and bind it to this exact XML schema, precisely like we were just looking at. Those things get a little bit brittle and problematic, right? Because then when you need to rev them or when there's a change, suddenly folks are going through and iterating all sorts of stuff just to add a field name. Next slide. And so we want to go through and separate that out, right? We want to break that dependency on the two if we can, or at least provide some guidance on how to better do this. Next slide. And we want to give them something where they can just give a basic table of what data they need to send, right? Maybe some additional properties and what those properties maybe could be named consistently. Maybe we can help standardize some of that naming around some of these very common scenarios we encounter, at least in the physical and cross-border trade side, right? We see some of this done in like UNCFACT and things like that, where there's some good naming, but once again, it's all tied up into all sorts of other directly embedded data encodings and formats that might change over time. It's not perfect. So let's try to simplify this. Next slide. So just question for the group. This is something I'm going to keep working on guidance wise in general, but it would be nice if I could get someone other than me and Ori and Mahmood looking at it going, hey, this is what we know. See Justin on the queue.
I was trying to let you finish before I jumped in.
Oh no, don't.
Okay, so two things. Why is this spicy?
Why is it spicy?
Yeah, why would it be here? This
Yeah.
sounds to be very general, very broad.
It
and I have a
is.
second question after this.
Yeah, it is. The reason it's spicy actually is just because it's directly related to credentials we were working at. So we
Okay.
threw it in here. So
that was like the motivating.
Yeah, this
push
was
for-
was tied to our
Okay.
motivating use cases actually.
Okay, no, that's interesting. The second bit is that I have been involved with several efforts that have tried to create a generic type system. The DID working group, which many of you were in, tried to kind of do something like that too, and that really fell apart and is a failure in terms of the typing system. I will fully state that here. It's really hard to do, and it's especially hard to get consensus about. Especially when you're doing anything that involves complex typing, sets, orders, anything like that. So what would this allow people to do that's any different? And how would it be any better?
It's a great question. Random chance, did you get a chance to read through this?
Oh, no, of course. No, not. No.
I was just checking.
Yeah. Well, in that case, does it point to an existing typing system like whatever the weird one from W3C or no?
We're actually not at that stage yet.
Okay.
What we're basically doing is saying, what are the basic things you need to make sure as a policy person you should describe? And what are the things you shouldn't? What are the good things not to bake in, right, into a policy doc to avoid problems? So while we were looking at shapes of data and stuff,
right.
It's the stuff that actually keeps that stuff from creeping in. So it's kind of the guidance to prevent policymakers from creeping that in. So this is a subtle nuance. And I think it's actually an important distinction because it's not something that comes up. And when I was looking around like my collection of like, hey, here's references I cite when I'm going and talking to policymakers about how to write policy, I didn't find anything on this. There wasn't a don't mix these things all together. And so it was really just a way, hey, maybe we could provide some basic guidance around there.
Okay, so this is basically the do not make a type ontology document.
Oh yeah, this is don't do the DID working group actually.
Right.
I mean, not for,
well, there's lots of
generously. I'm
reasons not
sure
to do
that
that,
someone's going to look at this recording and hold it back to me later. I'll get an email on it.
Absolutely. All right, thank you. That clears up a lot.
AJ?
Okay. So in a previous life, and it wasn't a standard, I guess it was an emerging specification. I worked on an information data modeling system for cybersecurity data. So I can see there are lots of dragons beyond the fun of the DID case. I think there are good bones here. So I know you're asking about adoption. I will, with a lot of people in the room, commit to reading it. It's interesting because I've been skimming it at this point. As an aside, have you talked to other people outside of the credential space, perhaps? Some of them are in NIST, some are not, around the technical language processing community, because I think you're getting to this interesting area, and that's what this document is about. It's structured data formats and ontologies aren't good for communicating with non-technical stakeholders. They're technical in the sense they're specialized in a regulatory or legal domain, and they have notions of things, but not the way computer scientists or engineers or protocol designers think. And there needs to be some way of bridging the gap. The TL people are very focused on safety concerns with maintenance of systems. There's some people in my employer, by the way, I'm AJ Stein. I didn't introduce myself. I work with colleagues in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they run a community of interest around this, and they have lots of papers. They might be interested, and I can do my own due diligence here and maybe get feedback from them on some of the notions of this paper. It seems very, paper draft. Apologies, it's late for me. If that would be beneficial beyond my immediate review. That is all.
AJ, that would be awesome contribution. To answer your question, yes, I did talk to some folks on that, kind of the technical writing aspect and some otherwise. I have some strong benefit in that my wife used to do some of that in a past life prior to what she's doing now. And I did check with some folks at National Defense University when we were preparing some coursework last year. So there were definitely some gaps found, and I would love extra eyes.
Fantastic. I'll try to work on that. Thank you.
Cool. I think a deck's going to show up, so I'm just not going to leave. I'm just going to stand here.
You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, excellent. So we're going to talk about why being first is not always being better. That was kind of the subtitle that jumped into my mind here, because we were able to kind of evaluate some cases and approaches and things we've seen and stuff like MDocs and other things like that that might have some gaps that don't really match the use cases we at least were looking at. So next slide. So what we're going to talk about right now is what we tentatively called SDCWT. I actually titled it COSE SDCWT, I think originally, and then because that was even before looking at or even discussing like maybe we should talk about like how do we do credentials more broadly. And it was the draft really that I think led to the kickoff of us discussing this, but my memory is very fuzzy, so don't quote me on that. Basically, a couple of the properties we were really after was that ability to do selective disclosure, particularly even at large scale with binary type credentials. So the case I was bringing up about exchanging agricultural inspections. There's other kinds of things like that, right, where you might have to selectively disclose some properties at, depending on who has a need to know. Additionally, proof of possession turns out to be really important, right? If someone's disclosing something, you want to know, like, are they actually, is that CNF in place, right? So that's something that we made sure was incorporated in this latest draft here. The other thing that we're really after is a property that I think everyone's familiar with here, but that's data minimization, right? Don't disclose things in the clear that you don't have to. There's probably good reasons for that. And so really what we're after is a way to take keys and array elements and make sure that they can be disclosed cleanly, consistently, and hidden and blinded, right, when appropriate. And so how we have approached this is to make sure that any CWT claims that are not explicitly marked as redactable by the issuer are disclosed, right? So we're going to give some guidance around the issuer. I give the issuer a little bit of control over what goes over the wire, what doesn't, what you can hide from someone else, and what you can't. Next slide. So basic diagram I ripped out of this version of the draft. But basically, we've got this three-party thing where you're talking about, right? The issuer goes ahead and says, yep, I've got this CWT, I pass it over to the holder. Then when you're looking at sending this over, you're presenting this over to a verifier, right? There's basically get a nonce from the verifier, get the nonce back, redact what you're going to redact, go ahead and hash things up, put your CNF in there, right? How do I own this key? And then you present that back to the verifier. I think I got all that flow right. Ori will probably tell me that I'm wrong and dumb, but maybe not. I'm not sure. Maybe I actually paid attention to what I was reading and writing. So next slide. So really what this is, right, when we look at what an SDCWT is, it's a CWT, literally just a CWT, but it contains some unique things, right? What are we actually signing? Well, it's got the digested, possibly, right, but salted disclosed claims. And the salt is key, right? We really want to make sure we're blinding properties. We don't want verifiers learning things that they're not intentionally supposed to know. We want to give that mechanism and that capability there. One of the key things here is that CNF must be present. That is a mandatory, right? That's the stance we're taking, at least in this version of the draft. That's not to say if this were adopted by the working group that we couldn't change that. That feels really important to those of us that started this out. And then the KBT must not be set by the issuer and must be set by the holder, right? It's really helping us separate these roles that they play, and also providing this ability for something to pass through multiple parties before ultimately being verified as not having been tampered with along the way. Really important in trade use cases. Next slide. So a couple of things, a couple of good properties. Once again, this is just copy paste right out of the draft because that's a good way to talk about what we're talking about. The issuer should confirm that the holder actually has the confirmation material, right? Don't just make an assumption. Don't take this in, right? Let's actually kick this out. There's some cases where you might skip it, but it's a real strong should. The other thing is that we should utilize nonces. There are cases, once again, you always get these little weird exception things, but you want to be pretty strong about like preventing replay attacks and stuff like that. So that should be accounted for. Next slide. So validation, you validate like a CWT. What do you know? Magic. So that's first step. Next slide. And then you go through and extract out, process, validate, you take any disclosed claims, you hash them up, and go through and make sure that the signatures all match. So you really want to go through and make sure everything's done. I seem to recall that we may have even written that like, hey, there's like these 5 steps you need to do in detail, somewhere around there. It's 3 to 5 steps, and that the order of those doesn't matter too much, right? There is some necessary processing orders, but they all must be computed in order to make sure that the verification is complete before either passing or failing the verification. Next slide. So an example, if you like looking at CDDL up on screen, sure, this is Hank's fault, guaranteed. I believe I hit merge just because I saw his name on it. So next slide. So some differences, CBORD tags, right? We're going through, and instead of doing _SD and some other things like that right there, we're making sure that we're using extended diagnostic notation, right? We want to make sure that an issuer claims can be made disclosable. And then we're taking advantage of unprotected headers instead of having to have the tilde at the end of an encoded JOT, right? So that's pretty, just kind of taking advantage of CBORD being CBORD, right? And COSE being COSE. The other thing that I know was in an earlier version, we may have actually stripped it out in this version, in which case I think we should put it back in with some explicit discussion around counter signatures and counter signature usage, because those come up a lot, but we'll have to take a look at it again and see if more text needs to be added there. Next slide. So this is really now a good time to ask any questions for myself, Hank, Ori, anyone else who worked on this. And then failing those questions, I think the other question back for the group is this something we want to work on? And if so, is this a good starting place for something for us to work on? I know it's in our charter, so it seemed like a natural place to go. And Rohan, I think, is up.
Yeah, Rowan May. I think this is a really important building block, and I want us to adopt it, and I'm also willing to help. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for the eyes.
Your Honor, Chef, I'm very supportive of the document. I'm a little bit confused, and I may have misunderstood. You started by describing a non-redactable flag, but then you didn't talk about it anymore, and you didn't mention it when you talked about the disclosure algorithms. So I'm a bit confused and suspicious of the flag.
Yeah, what I was getting at there, so it might be 2 more slides back. One more. One more. I can't remember how I built this deck out. It was late at night. Don't blame me. But basically, the issuer can specify that certain things should not be redacted. So like, hey, you must pass this along as a piece of information, right? Because sometimes you might need an identifier especially so that it's consistently named, right? And so that gives the issuer control over that. But then says, hey, now you as a holder can redact the rest of these things, right? We've seen multiple cases where that can come up. Like, and I'll give a good example on guidance rolling back to the ag case. You would probably have the identifier or the GLN a lot of times, right? I forget what that actually stands for on GS1 terms, but the GLN so the location number for that farm that it originated at, and the inspection result might be required to always pass along. Does that make sense?
I can't speak specifically to agricultural examples, but I think that the holder will need to have some policy around what is disclosed. Yes. And there may well be negotiation of what is disclosed. And so I think you'd need this business logic anyway, and trying to codify it in the VC itself is probably just adding complexity rather than
Yeah, you're on great point. I think the main thing we wanted to make sure is that the credential format itself, the disclosure format, permits cases and that could arise, so that that policy can be set right at a separate layer. Because otherwise it might be a little more, you might not have a technical mechanism of enforcing it, right? So that was just, I think, where our thinking was, if I remember correctly, but Hank will probably tell me I'm wrong somehow.
So we've got just about 5 minutes left and 4 people in queue, so be efficient.
Be efficient. So here I am. Brian Campbell, Jose enthusiast and crusader against multiple token types. About to ask a semi-rhetorical question that I will want an answer for. The ISO already defines a kind of token which offers selective disclosure and proof of possession type semantics in CBOR with COSE signatures.
Are
So
those open standards or are they behind a paywall?
I am not in a position to make statements regarding the ISO's policy or availability of their documents. Did I?
So what, so your question is?
So Tony
Is-
Nadler, I do work on the document that Brian Campbell's talking about in ISO, and it is a specification. You do have to pay for the specification, but it is generally available. So depends on what your definition of open is.
That's definitely out of scope for the group.
Yeah, it's why it's semi-rhetorical. I don't like the policy either. But does it make sense to be duplicating that kind of work?
It's a good question.
It's a very fair question.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
I also don't think that I not wanting to pay for that document.
I also
perhaps.
don't want to pay for it.
Yeah. So I suspect though, perhaps, and maybe someone in the room could comment that has paid for this document because it's in their budget or because they're required to or something. I suspect that maybe there's some different hashing and salting mechanisms and things like that that introduce some good properties here. So
My understanding is that overall concepts, the specifics are quite different. The concepts are the same, so it delivers the same sort of functional use cases. Anyway, I just felt like I had to ask. More specifically, a different question, I'm sorry. The requirement for proof of possession, it was actually, I believe, use cases that were driven by you or perhaps some of your co-authors or related that push to have that stuff be optional in the somewhat equivalent SD-JOT specification. And at least my understanding of like presentation from one party to another and another to another were things that you actually needed here. So I was a little surprised to see that as being a hard requirement.
Hank, would you like to speak to proof of possession or Ori? Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have,
Yeah.
we've got a break coming
We
soon.
don't have
so
time. I'll
keep it. We can maybe pick this up again later.
Christina?
I don't like speaking after Brian because he usually mentions my questions, but +1 to his first question, I would like to hear a reason, which is not we don't want it to be behind a paywall. I was hoping to get a bit more technical argument, like why MDocs defined in ISO do not meet your use case. I think I can guess, but I think that would be a much stronger argument to do this work. Because like as an SD-JOT author, we obviously did look into MDocs and we did have pretty good reasons why our design deviates from that design quite significantly. So, my second question was actually kind of digging deeper to Brian's second question. So what we have done in the last working group for SD-JOT and SD-JOT VC specifications is partially layering, how some people call it, but for SD-JOT, we thought it's a, really use case general kind of a container, like a JOT. We're going to define it because we want it to be like a general mechanism. And then for a very specific use cases that some people had in mind, we have defined as DJOT BC. And when I read through his DCWT draft, I got an impression where it's right now somewhere in between. And I don't, so for example, it mandates confirmation claim while the rest of the CWT claims seem to be optional, which I think you told me is probably not that intended. So we'd like to see that to be clear. I don't have a strong opinion yet. Like if you already have a very specific set of use cases and you do not need this layering separation, like make it very clear that it's close to SDCWTBC, or if that's not the case, maybe have if one draft that is close to SD-CWT where confirmation claim is not mandated, and then follow up with the second one. So suggestion.
Thank you, Christina. I think those would be excellent things to consider were this to be a working group draft rather than an individual internet draft.
Okay, we are actually technically at start of break. So
if anyone wants to go to break, we'll go. And we'll just pick this up again in half an hour.
I will have forgotten what this is about.
No.
So I can't speak to the MDoc because it is literally invisible to me. So, but as a person that is kind of used to align JSON things and CBOR things with CDDL, we'll write CDDL that tries to do this here in the IETF, and then you can give it to someone that owns the ISO spec and then make them review. So that's a good way to check if it's a redundant work or not. The exercise of aligning work here in the IETF is necessary in any case.
Yes.
So that's why I am now onboarded on the SDCWT ID, because we need to have that check exercised, and then we go from there.
Oh, harness dropped. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's break. 30 minutes. We'll be starting on time.
I think we do.
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Do you know if it's the same data tracker or is it a different one? Since